here on clearing the fog, lifting the fog, getting rid of the misconceptions of Islam and the message that comes with it. Stay tuned for more right here.
My name is Sharif Tuni, and this is brought to you from Huda TV. In today's edition, we'll be discussing about the day and night.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala equated the samawat with darkness, the firmament with darkness, and equated the earth with light. Why? Are there really pillars that cannot be seen?
Or is it an unseen pillar?
Everything is running, but the relationships are fixed.
Yes.
So that it would appear to people as if nothing is running, you see. We are destroying our environment with our own hands. And that's why the Quran says ظهر الفساد في البر والبحر بما كسبت أيدي الناس ليذيقهم بعض الذي عملوا لعلهم يرجعون.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah. This is the second part of our program in dealing with the subject of clearing away these misconceptions or lifting the fog with regard to the subject of who do we actually worship. And I want to give you now the example of what really did happen to us one time with this question about Muslims worshiping a black box in the desert. I was giving a talk similar to the one that I've been talking about here in a masjid in Toronto, Canada. After the talk, a gentleman came up to me and he said, listen, I want to ask you a question. Why is it you Muslims worship this black box in the desert? And I said, whoa, let's start from the beginning. And I actually went through the steps and asked the Muslims to listen how we answer the question. And I said to him, thank you for asking us about our religion. First of all, in Islam, we must always tell the truth. Because if we don't, we can go to hell forever. The second thing is that we have the proof. Everything in Islam is recorded, it's documented, and it's preserved in authentic form so that there's no question about what was really taught 1400 years ago. And finally, a lot of times we have to clear up the question before we can answer it because it may contain within it something that's, well, incorrect. So we'll begin with that. And by the way, while you're listening to the answer, if you hear something that you said, gee, I didn't know that, or if you find yourself saying, gee, I like that for me, this is something nice, and I can relate to that, then my question to you would be, are you going to be prepared then to consider worshiping your Lord and your God alone without any partners? Because you see, that's all Islam is really about anyway. The gentleman looked at me and he said, huh? I said, yes. I'm just telling you that while you listen to the answer, if you find things that you really like, are you going to be prepared then to consider worshiping God, your God, on His terms? That's what Islam is about. He said, okay, go ahead. So then I gave him the answer. And I began like this, by explaining that first and foremost, who is Allah? As we mentioned in the first part of the segment of this particular program today. We talked about who is Allah and why we worship Him alone. He has no partners. Then I came to the part about the black box. The black box is actually a place in the desert that's been constructed a long time ago and then maintained for century after century by the various tribes and descendants of Ishmael. He was surprised to learn that we know about Ishmael. I said, oh, of course. You see, Islam is teaching us about the sons of Abraham. Abraham has two sons, Ishaq, or Isaac as you call him, and Ismail, or Ishmael, as is mentioned in the Bible. These two sons are both descendants of Abraham. And both of them are predicted in the Bible to have many generations, many of their children. As many as the sand of the sea and as many as the stars in the heaven. And this is comparing one to the other. He agrees with me, he goes, yeah, and? I said, okay. So just in the same way that we realize that Isaac had many descendants that came from him, and these are the ones that are referred to as the chosen to receive guidance, or the Yahud. So in the same way is Ishmael, or Ismail. He has also many descendants. When Abraham took his son Ishmael to the desert with his mother, who we call her Hajar, and you call her Hagar, in the book of Genesis in the Old Testament. When they went to the desert, there was a place there, a specific place, that was built up, that they built upon it this house of Allah, or Kaaba. And this has been maintained ever since until this very day. He said, oh, I didn't know that. I said, well, that's okay. Let me explain, too, that that's not the only house of Allah. There were other places where people worshiped God. And the Old Testament is famous for mentioning these booths that were set up for the prophets to worship there in these particular places. And one of the most famous that you may be familiar with is Jerusalem itself, when people used to all face toward Jerusalem, and Jews today still face toward Jerusalem for their worship. Now, there's another one in the New Testament. You may not be familiar with it by its correct name in Arabic, but you'll recognize it right away with the English version. Bethlehem. Beit Lehem. Which means what? It's meaning a slaughterhouse. The house of flesh or meat. And that was where Jesus, peace be upon him, was born, was into this city, which was well known for its slaughterhouses. So this gives us an idea now that sometimes we hear words that we think that are some kind of sacred thing, and it's just explaining a place. And the same is true for the place that we worship God in the desert. You call it the black box or the cube, and we're saying that we don't worship God there in it, but we direct our worship to God by facing that way. But it's different than the icons that we hear about in the Catholic Church. An icon is something that you worship to get to God. You go through this to get to Him, and we don't do that. That is not the purpose of the Kaaba. It's a place for us to direct our devotion, as in lining up, as in being in organized lines, but the heart is directly worshiping Allah without going through a box or through anybody. We don't worship through that, nor do we worship through the one standing in front of us called the Imam. Our prayers don't go through him either, but rather this is to give us all direction, and that's the main purpose behind it. Because Allah tells us in the Quran itself that it is not piousness or righteousness that you are turning your faces to the east or to the west. But righteousness is that what? That you have this right attitude and belief in God and a pure heart, and you're dedicating that heart to Him. This is the meaning behind it. And so once we understand that, then we realize that we're not worshiping anything on this earth, whether it is a man or a rock, a stick, a stone, or anything. Keep in mind that this is the same place in the desert where Ishmael and his father Abraham went to worship. And they performed certain anasik, or rituals that were carried forward even by their descendants and finally to Muhammad. It's not something new, and it's well established. And by the way, there's also a story amongst the Israeliyat, which means the stories from Israel, previous generations, talking about that when Adam and Eve first were put out of the Jannah, or the paradise, that this is the place where Adam went to make his prostration. This is where Adam went to put his head down on the ground and ask for forgiveness for having eaten the fruit. And certainly, if that's a true story, that is an amazing place, a wonderful place for us to turn our direction and ask forgiveness from Allah, by putting our heads down on the ground and asking Allah to forgive us. It's not so much the place, it's the attitude. And our attitude is one of gratitude. As Muslims, we put our head down on the ground to the Almighty, the one above. And in this position, with the head on the ground, lowering ourselves in front of Him, then we have done the most amazing thing. The human being who considers himself so proud and arrogant lowers himself before the Lord of the worlds, puts his head on the ground and asks Him, "Oh God, forgive me. Forgive me and have mercy on me." So this really gives us a chance to understand the marker, the place where we all face. We don't worship that, but we worship the God that created that and everything else. And we line up all together, uniting our hearts and our worship, and we all face the same direction wherever we are in the world. And this is something amazing that you only find in Islam. Because once a year, every year, the Muslims gather at this place, the Kaaba, in Mecca, to worship the Rabbil Alameen, the Lord of the worlds. We go there and we perform these rituals, and this is to remember and commemorate what Abraham and his son Ismail did centuries and millenniums ago. It's not something new whatsoever. In fact, it's a return back to the original form of worship and the original place of worship of the one God of Abraham, the God of all of the prophets. Once I presented this to the gentleman there in Canada, he was amazed, he was astounded, and he was looking at me like, I didn't know that. I didn't realize this. Then he turns and he says to me, "You know what? This makes sense. This is exactly what I've always believed, that there's only one God, and He doesn't have partners. I don't believe in 3 gods or 2 gods. I don't believe in the Son of a God. I believe just in the one God. And I said, well, this is what we believe. He said, well, I believe in the God of Abraham. I said, this is what we believe. I said, now I have a question for you. Remember what I said in the beginning? If you heard yourself say, gee, I like this for me. Gee, this is what I already believed. Would you be prepared then to worship your God and my God, your Lord and my Lord, alone without partners? He goes, yeah. I said, okay. And that gave us an opportunity right then to ask him if he's prepared to enter into Islam, by explaining now the details of what is Islam. We talked a little bit about, of course, the belief or the Aqidah of Islam, and then we went to the 5 pillars of Islam. I explained to him that being a Muslim, you obey Allah, and one of the things Allah has asked us to do after entering into Islam, of course, is to make the Shahada, give the statement of La ilaha illallah. None is worthy to worship except Allah, and Muhammad ar Rasulullah, that Muhammad is His messenger, and as such, I'm going to use him as my example and follow his teachings. Understanding that, then I know that I have to begin to pray 5 times a day, called Salawat al-Khams, and I explained that to him. We talked about the fasting in Islam, that we have to, every year, fast the month of Ramadan. And then we talked about the zakah, and we spoke about the hajj to the Bayt of Allah, which is how the whole question came to begin with, talking about making this pilgrimage. And he asked me about that, and I said, the only ones who are allowed to make this pilgrimage are real Muslims. So the only way you could go there and really worship the Lord of the worlds is to be a Muslim. And he said, you know what, I really am ready to be a Muslim. And I understand it, I want to do it. So we gave him Shahada right there in front of the whole masjid there in Toronto, Canada. And he took his Shahada. He said, Ashadu an la ilaha illallah, wa ashadu anna Muhammadan abduhu rasul. I bear witness in open testimony. There's none to worship except the one Almighty God, and He has no partners. And I bear witness in open testimony to the prophethood of all the prophets, starting with Adam and going to Muhammad. Peace and blessings be upon them all. He said it, and what means that in Arabic, Ashadu la ilaha illallah, ashadu Muhammad Rasulullah. Today, I'm happy to announce to you and report that this gentleman has become a very fine Muslim. He married one of our Muslim sisters from Somalia, and together they're living a very good life as Muslims in Canada, helping other people to do what we're trying to do with our series right here, and that's to clear up these misconceptions and lift the fog that's been promoted out here about what is Islam and who are the Muslims. That's what our series is about. We'll hope you'll be back for more of this right here on Huda TV. This is something important for all Muslims to realize. It's our obligation, it's our responsibility to lift the fog and let people see the real Islam on real, easy, simple terms. This is your host, Yusuf Estes, and it's my pleasure and privilege to be with all of you on these subjects. We've got a lot more right here on Huda TV. Stay tuned for more right here. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.